Hello and welcome. My name is Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour on Goldster Purpose, Passion and Grit. And today we are going to talk about community. What is a community? What is the glue that holds it together? The village, the sports team, the pub, history, the schools, or a virtual community like there is in Goldster? We're going to anchor our conversation on a specific community in West Somerset, where the local newspaper was started by my guest's great-great-grandfather. And as a strapping young lad, he worked on it for a while before becoming a senior figure in BBC News and traveling the world through that global community, then returning to home soil, where he went through the archives of the newspaper dating back to 1860. Of the West Somerset Free Press and produced a beautifully illustrated book, West Somerset in the News, about his hearth and home community. Some of the stories about appeasement in the Second World War and the Liberal leader, Jeremy Thorpe, anyone remember him, are captivating. And as we go through them, pitch into the chat and tell us about your community, the stories, how important it is in your lives. And on that note, welcome Jeff Cox to Goldster Purpose, Passion and Grit.
Thank you, Humphrey. Pleasure to be with you. It's a rare reversal of roles for me. The journalist is a chance for me to talk about myself.
Yes.
I've done before, so thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you. You were always on the other side of it, weren't you? So, yeah. But tell us, we're going to talk about West Somerset, which is your community. Just ground us in where are you? What are the main towns, the landscapes? What should we know about it?
Okay, well, I'm speaking to you from a small village called Porlock. It's on the Exmoor coast, so that's the southern coast of the Bristol Channel. I look out my front door and I can see South Wales. It's a wonderfully clear day, very cold day down here. So I'm on the coast here. West Somerset is a kind of a contrast of tourist villages along the coastline, and then inland you've got the mouth of the Exmoor National Park. A beautiful area, but a very kind of impoverished rural area where mainly farmland up there. The whole area is essentially based on tourism. That's the main income here, tourism and agriculture.
And was it always tourism, or what did it have, manufacturing or something else in its centuries past?
Yeah, I mean, tourism kind of started within the nation in the early sort of 1810s, 1820s, when Europe was cut off because of the Napoleonic Wars. So tourists started to come down here then, but it only really took off when the railways arrived. The railway didn't get to Minehead until 1874, but tourism had started by then, and by that time the fishing trade, the actual shipping trade across to South Wales and mainly to the Caribbean, that had died down quite a lot in Minehead. So yes, since about the 1870s, tourism has been one of the main features and employers here.
Okay, that's interesting. So many years ago, not just since manufacturing wound down in Britain and other things like that. Now, you Jeff, you've traveled the world and you've traveled Britain. How would you what context would you place West Somerset into the other communities that you know?
Well, as I say, really, it was for up until the 1870s, it was very isolated. Robert Southey, the poet laureate, was down here in, I think it was 1798, and he described Porlock, where I live, as the end of the world, because there was no means of transportation beyond literally where I'm speaking to you from, at the foot of Porlock Hill, which is kind of quite well known around the country as the steepest A road in Great Britain. Port Minehead was flourishing, but then after the fishing trade died down, the area itself was really quite isolated from the expansion of Victorian Britain, really until the railways arrived.
Goodness. And remind us, when did the railways arrive?
It got to the county town of Taunton, which is 25 miles from here, in 1843. Then it was another kind of 2-hour stagecoach ride from Taunton through to Minehead. the railway actually came through. Isambard Kingdom Brunel was commissioned to design the link from Taunton to Minehead. In fact, he drew up the plans, but he actually had died before they started cutting the first turf. The train actually arrived, the railway arrived into Minehead in 1874.
And what is the journey time now between where you are and, say, London?
Well, it takes about, so to drive, although the railway line still exists from Minehead to Taunton, it was closed down as part of the beaching cuts in the 1970s. It's now a heritage line, but it doesn't go through to Taunton. So you have to drive. So from where I am here in Porlock, it takes an hour to get to Taunton, and then you're on the motorways, and suddenly you hook up to the infrastructure of the motorways. It's 40 minutes to Bristol, to get to the outskirts of London, 2.5 hours, I suppose.
Okay, so you're still, because of that railway closure, you're still reasonably isolated, as I should say. I just want to, the books behind me here, which I think most of anybody here knows is a virtual background of a library in one of those London fusty clubs. I see that you've got similar next to you. Do you actually read them? Have you sort of picked them up from...
Well, they actually come out, unlike yours would, Humphrey, yeah.
And what are they of? I mean, are they of...
Well, we'll get on to the family newspaper, but yes, as my family started the local newspaper, the West Somerset Free Press in 1860, in the following sort of 2 or 3 decades, there was quite an explosion, I think, around the country of interest in local history, of recording local history. So these books behind me, you can see, these are all various books based on very small communities. They're a history of a small, tiny village called Selworthy, population no more than 200 or 300, I suppose. But here is, there we are, a book all about the history of Selworthy. So as the local newspaper, we acquired an amazing library of authentic, genuine local history books, which I have the good fortune now to possess.
And who wrote them? Sort of retired vicars or?
Exactly right. Exactly right. The Reverend F. Hancock, he did most of them. Francis Hancock, and it was either not necessarily retired vicars, but they seemed to have time on their hands in those days.
Right.
But also local gentry. So there was a guy called Charles Chadwick Healy, who was a High Court judge, but actually built a rather large mansion down here on the outskirts of Porlock. And he wrote an enormous volume called The History of Parts of West Somerset, which is too big to fit on my bookshelf, actually. But we would literally go back through to the original source material, from the Domesday book right through to all the parish records, all the church records. And it was wonderful. They actually took the effort to compile the history of, yes, my little community here, but I'm sure the same applies around the country.
Well, I just want to say, I want to ask you what your sense of community is, what a community is. And I want our audience to chip in on the chat to say what you think a community is. And as Jeff tells his stories, come in with your stories as well, as the vicar that wrote the book, and we've got a lot more to do. But Jeff, give us your sense, your definition, I don't know what the word is, of a community.
That's a big question. Well, I suppose it all comes down to the family and the infrastructure that families rely on, be them the social services, the church, the employers, obviously the schools. It all, in terms of, I'd best describe it in my own community here in Porlock. I mean, we are less than 2,000 people. We're quite an elderly population. At one stage, Porlock had the highest proportion of retired citizens in the UK, which you kind of think is, oh, it must be rather a dead and ossified group of people. Absolutely no. It is vibrant. There are things going on every weekend, community activities. And yes, it is very much like every community, I'm sure, throughout the UK, it's based on supporting each other and valuing and treasuring actually what we have.
Yes, I think that's a very apt description. I understand that, and your community, that even the one you described now, but from 1860, was it held together by the newspaper that your great grandfather started? Tell us about that.
Well, I think that held together would be rather a grand claim, but certainly in some ways, I think it established the concept of West Somerset by its circulation area. Yes, there was the western part of the county, but certainly, well, at the time, it was utterly crucial because it was the one source of information. So it started really because there was a growing literate society as schools were developing the 1840s and 50s. People were more literate, wanted to know what was going on. There was a county newspaper in Taunton, but nothing that focused on our particular community. And yes, there was even then a sensible West Somerset community, rural, hunting activities on the moor. Yes, tourism was starting. So yes, I mean, obviously, no radio, no television, no internet. Yes, national newspapers, but they only came down to this part about 2 or 3 days late because of the transportation problems. And also a newspaper in those days, before 1850, when the stamp duty was removed from newspapers, a national newspaper would cost around about £4. Well, actually, to be honest, given the price of newspapers today, it doesn't sound so much more, but certainly it was way beyond the pocket of anyone down here. And also it came down 2 or 3 days late. So when the West Somerset Free Press was started by my great-great-grandfather, it contained, yes, local news, yes, local advertising, but also national news and international news. So the very first edition of the West Somerset Free Press in July 1860 has reported about Garibaldi in Italy fighting for the independence of Italy. At that time, it was a group of different kind of small states, stateless. But Garibaldi is there, the American War of Independence, or the Civil War.
Civil War, yes.
Free press.
So where did he get that? Where did he get that information from?
Well, the way it started was that I think with many local newspapers, this was compiled in London. So when the first Free Press was published, it was 8 pages long. 4 of those pages were printed in London with national news, international news, reports of train crashes in Sunderland or events in Parliament. Those 4 pages were pre-printed and sent down to Willerton, where we published. And then my great-great-grandfather and his team of 4 system printers, they would then compile another 4 pages of local news, local advertising, stitch it together, and therefore you would sell your 8-page West Somerset Free Press for a penny halfpenny. And that gave you all the news you need to know. And that was obviously your only source of news.
How interesting. And tell us about your great-great-grandfather. What was his name? What was his motivation, his trade before he started the newspaper?
He was called Samuel Cox. He was born into a fishing family along the coast here to the east, a place called Watchet. He trained as a printer. He did his indentures down in Newlyn near Penzance. He went up to Edinburgh, and then he came down, set his own printing business up in the 1850s and a small bookshop. The bookshop also was a lending library because there were no libraries available. So that again was a business enterprise with establishing a library of newspapers. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1850s in Westminster, because of the growing demand for information and a growing literate population, they removed the stamp tax and the tax on advertising that had made newspapers unaffordable to vast reading population. So Samuel Cox saw the opportunity. He called it the West Somerset Free Press. If you look around the country, you will find a number of other free presses. There's the press, it has a kind of nice radical feel to it. It's not the free, certainly in terms of the West Somerset Free Press, made clear it was free of tax.
Not free of cost, but free of tax.
Free of tax. So
interesting.
West Somerset Free Press, it was free of stamp duty and advertising duty. So that he saw the opportunity, and it wasn't welcomed by everybody. Well, it was welcomed by quite a decent readership, but the local gentry actually tried to run him out of business. They did not like the idea of having a better informed workforce. So if one farmer on one side of the Quantock Hills, we cover the Quantocks as well, was paying his labourer 1 6 a week, and found out that across the hill someone was getting paid 2 shillings a week, that was seen to be, by those who had the vested interest, to be destabilising. So in fact, when he started, he had quite a problem. The local gentry tried to run him out of business, boycotted his shop, etc. But he stuck to his guns, and it's still going today.
And in that class structure of Britain, he was not then part of the elite or the
No.
He was a tradesman, was he?
He exactly. He was, he got his hands dirty every day. Got very, ink on his fingers on a Thursday. No. He was a challenge to that structure.
Okay. How fascinating. And when you were going through it, because you wrote this beautiful book, or compiled this beautiful book from 1860, what was the first big story that sort of struck you as a sort of, holy Moses, this is a fantastic story?
Well, I mean, if you look at the first page, every editor starting a new newspaper just hopes he's got a good story to tell, to hook his readership and wants him to come back for more. About 25 miles to the east of here, over the Quantock, a place called Spaxton, a Church of England cleric, should we say, on the fringes of the established church, had set up his own private, it was called the Abode of Love. And he was having his own religious services on a rather closed community. And for some reason or another, he was attracting mainly young female acolytes to his closed community. Various allegations were made about what was going on behind the walls of the Abode of Love, but a number of parents of the young women who were attracted to this suspect setup were most concerned that they were being fleeced of large amounts of money. Not just they were concerned about the fate of their daughters, but the daughters were giving the dodgy cleric large amounts of money. So that was in the very first edition. I mean, I used the phrase sex scandal. It was sex, it was money, it was parents worried about the fate of their children. Not a bad story to start off with. Not that that was a true reflection of the rest of the newspaper. Mainly it was shipping reports, it was the fat stock market reports, it was the new roof going on the church at Withiel Glory. But that was there.
This is like a local cult or something that he was running that was...
I mean, the cult did not spread beyond the confines of the premises.
Yes.
I say, the place called Spaxton. But it wasn't a true reflection of the community. It outraged the community. Hence, it was, you asked the kind of stories, it was quite a juicy story to start with.
And when it was published, Jeff, did it have an impact that he got stopped, or was it like the sub postmasters here that we're hearing at the moment and nobody did a damn thing about it?
Most exactly at the same time scale. It was about 25 years later. Finally, he was actually defrocked formally by the Church of England. It did take about 25 years for the process to develop.
I have to ask, this is sort of slightly tangential, but we're talking about the closeness of communities. I mentioned the postmasters. Is there something specific to British thinking or life that sort of blocks these things happening? I mean, you had a new newspaper, a story which shocked the population, but nothing happened.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what kind of journalist you are, I suppose. I mean, I've been brought up in even before the BBC, so in terms of impartial investigating the facts, reporting the facts, and then letting the reaction be as it is. It's up to the public to take what action they want as a result of the facts that we display in front of them in as powerful a way, in as truthful a way as possible. And I think it's almost the same. Certainly go back to the West Somerset Free Press. It's never been a campaigning newspaper. It simply reported the progress of what was happening. In this case, the abode of love and the concerns. I think it's similar, sadly, with the postmasters and mistresses. That was widely reported. As we know, Computer Weekly, the BBC were on it very, very early, from local BBC News, became Panorama and File on 4. The facts have been there for 10, 12 years.
Mm. But people have to. And did the getting back to that era again, that story particularly, but you mentioned the discrepancy in payments between farm labourers and other things like that. Did you notice as you went through the files an impact that reporting was having on the community?
No, not really. No, it was. I suppose the only impact you could possibly pick up is as you'd wish, in the letters column, which is your, I suppose, early representation of social media and people having a view on what they're hearing about. It was immensely valuable looking through. Essentially, I turned, in researching the book you kindly referred to, West Somerset News, I turned every single page of the West Somerset Free Press from 1860 through until 2010, the anniversary when the book came out. Yes, of course, you look for the news stories, but actually equally revealing were the response in the letters column. But at no stage were the letters column or did the newspaper become a campaigning platform. It was a platform for people to express their views. I can't say that the Free Press ever in those days made any material change to local government policy or the fate of an individual. And
did it have an editorial?
It had an editorial, but it wasn't a political editorial. It was very much based on community, the needs of the community. It never took a view whether conservative or liberal or more recently Labour. It's never had a political point of view. Editorials actually died out after about 30 years, I imagine. It wasn't that kind of newspaper.
Okay, and having studied that and put together your own community, and as I've said, you've seen communities all around the world, and some sort of rise up and go on strike and become particularly active and restive when there's injustices done or scandals happen. But that's not the nature of the community you're in.
No, I think that's the nature of many more rural areas, but also we're talking about local newspapers. I think it's unusual for a local newspaper to take up an issue, certainly historically. Yes, things have changed, the society has changed in the last 30, 40 years. I guess that has changed as well. But certainly going back to the first, beyond the Second World War, it was simply reportage. It would report. It was the organ of record, an immensely valuable organ of record, telling the people in the community the main events, be they large events in the community or the fate of individuals.
But talking about the big issues, you had a suffragette going to Minehead in 1911, Emily Pankhurst, and
yeah, I mean,
there was stuff going on there, wasn't there?
Yeah, Yeah, there was. I mean, the big world did impinge on us now and again. Yeah, I mean, that was the joy of doing this research, is actually spending the time, turning all those pages and discovering interesting stories completely long forgotten. No one down here knew that in 1911, Emmeline Pankhurst, it was a by-election in 1911, and obviously the suffragette cause was building up. It was a big national cause, and they quite obviously would spot on a community for a by-election where they could concentrate their resources. So yes, it was a conservative held seat. The Conservatives actually were in favour of suffrage for not universal suffrage for women, but those who qualified through ownership of property. So yes, Emmeline Pankhurst came down, which is wonderful. A big, well-attended rally in Minehead. She makes clear that the women in Minehead are doing two jobs, and the men should recognise it. The women in Minehead are both bringing up the children, and very often having full-time jobs as well. It's high time the men recognise that and gave the women the vote. But actually, more intriguingly, the following weekend, Emmeline Pankhurst had a very fiery number two in the suffragette movement, a lady called Miss Annie Kenny. She was a very fiery former mill worker girl from Lancashire, quite a hothead, very controversial. She was doing a rally down on the Esplanade, which is on the edge of the harbour in Watchet, at the time a busy trading port. The tide was out, which is significant. She was doing a rally on like a low loader truck, a very noisy rally. Round the corner, she was basically talking to a conservative crowd, and they were supporting suffrage. Round the corner come the Liberal supporters, who are sitting on the fence, but not really very supportive of suffrage. A fight ensues. Some of the Liberals grab hold of the low loader, and they are dragging it towards the edge of the harbour. I say the tide is out. It not been for the bravery of P.C. Penny, who intervenes in a moment, it saves the suffragettes being basically tipped over into the very muddy harbour of Watchet. So sometimes big news does arrive in West Somerset, but even then, the story only merited in the newspaper. We're not screaming headlines. It was just sort of a, page 8, very small headline: Miss Annie Kenny denied her opportunity to speak. 7 or 8 paragraphs, and then we go to the fat stock market.
Good. And so on that, because that's a captivating story for me, well, what was the headline on that day, on that edition?
I could try and find it for you, but I think it was Miss Kenny denied her. I'll find it for you. Here we are. I'm going to read to you. It's a very, very small: suffragettes that watch it. And then another one: Miss Annie Kenny refused a hearing. And then we go on to very dense description of what happened, which is very
on an inside page. That was.
Well, the West Somerset Free Press only put front page news on the front page in 1972. It was very much like the Times newspaper. I mean, I think you and I, Humphrey, still recall when the Times still carried adverts on the front page.
Yes.
Okay. That was in the 1970s, before the Times put news on the front page.
And
I think.
Sorry, go on.
No. Sorry, the internet jumped. I didn't quite hear the question.
No. What is it on the Mary Kenny, the suffragette? Yep. Were there any letters that?
I must admit, I don't recall. It was some time since I read.
It's fascinating. And in 1911, who was running the paper then? Because Sam Cox presumably wouldn't.
Yeah, so Sam Cox handed over to his son Herbert in 1900. So as the Victorian age ended, or actually died in 1901. So basically, the Cox family did the same thing. We passed it on to the generation. So in 1911. My great-grandfather Herbert was running the newspaper, and also my grandfather had just started as a trainee on the newspaper as well. So
goodness.
yes, it's been family run for the first 120 years.
And what was the circulation then?
Well, I must admit, I'm not quite sure back in 1911, but when I was working on the newspaper, I worked on it in the mid 1970s, which I guess was about the height of the circulation. It was around about 13,000, and the total potential readership, I suppose, was about 40,000, something like that within the area.
Because it would be left in doctors' waiting rooms, libraries, shops,
and one copy would be read by three members of the family,
and that sort of thing. This is the. I'm going to give a call to our audience. If you've got anything to say about your community, again, any stories from your community, any suffragettes dropped by, let us know, because we want to get some sort of context here. Because the next story that I've sort of noted here was there was a vote on appeasement. The Chamberlain coming up to the Second World War, and Somerset was the first constituency to vote or something. Tell us about that.
So, Chamberlain goes to meet Hitler in the autumn of 1938. He comes back waving his peace for our time. We can trust Hitler. He has no further ambitions within Europe. About 3 weeks later, after Chamberlain returned with his peace deal with Hitler, was a by-election, another by-election in West Somerset. It actually was the Bridgewater constituency then. And both the Liberal Party and the Labour parties opposed Chamberlain's policy. The Conservatives, who had held the seat here for the last 45 years and had a majority of 10,000, they were foursquare behind their Prime Minister Chamberlain. Both Labour and Liberals stood down, and they supported an independent candidate whose only platform was critical of Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler. So it's the first time Britain had a chance to give its public opinion on, was Chamberlain right to trust Hitler? So an independent candidate, a guy called Vernon Bartlett, he was a News Chronicle reporter. He in fact had been at Munich and had reported the talks with Hitler and Chamberlain. He's adopted as the independent candidate, Labour and Liberals supporting him. It is said that in the Chancellery in Berlin, they were not on tenterhooks, but they were taking notice of what the people of West Somerset were to say about appeasement or not. Come a very lively election, 82% of the electorate voted, most extraordinary turnout. And come the Friday morning in Bridgewater, Town Hall, returning officer on the balcony. I say it was a previous Conservative majority of 10,000. It held the seat for the previous 45 years. Vernon Bartlett won the vote by 2,500 votes. So West Somerset had basically spoken saying, no, we don't believe Chamberlain, we don't trust Hitler. At that time, Churchill was lobbying, saying, no, we cannot trust this man, we've got to rearm. So it's the first time the nation had a chance to give their view on the Munich Agreement.
That is a fascinating story. And when you look at the, in fact, before I ask the question, that's quite a similar thing that happened to our colleague Martin Bell, wasn't it? When he went in 1997, the Labour stood down and let him run as an independent in Tatton.
That's right. I mean, not on the issue of alleged corruption of Parliament.
That's right. Yes. I mean, it wasn't as big an issue, but it was a similar. But tell me, Jeff. I mean, the way you tell that story there, it hasn't really changed that much, has it? I mean, in the issues that we've got, social media, we've got the internet, we've got all that sort of stuff. But actually, when a big issue comes in, the tactics are the same, thinking the same.
Well, I mean, again, I'm not quite sure how to answer that one, but again, it comes down to when the facts are put before, in this case, an electorate. Okay, you might say, the facts were represented one way or the other by Brendan Bartlett on the independent side or the Conservative candidates. Yes, it engaged. I suppose it was evidence, undeniably, of how much everybody is engaged on a big issue like that. And on that occasion, of course, it was the future of the nation, the future of Europe. It was very, very significant. And the fact that I say 82% of the electorate turned out to vote demonstrates how, yes, when people are exercised, they will express their views.
And there's that balance, isn't there, between the big national issue that was there and a community issue? Because I believe somewhere there was an independent candidate that won a parliamentary seat because he was campaigning to keep the hospital open.
That's right. I think that was in Herefordshire somewhere. That's right.
Yes.
He was a former doctor who stood, I think, in the 97 election. And that was the one thing. It was the early, exactly that. Proposal to close the local hospital. He stood on it. I think it was it Wire Forest? Anyway, there we are.
Yes, yes. So there's this sort of graph, I guess, of a tipping point of where people are going to be exercised by a big national issue or by the local issue, and will go, and the party doesn't matter. They will then go for the person that's going to fight that issue.
Well, that's right, and that was the prime example. The party didn't matter. This guy was independent. He wasn't seeking to replace the Conservative government in power. He was just choosing that one issue as his platform.
Yeah, and did the West Somerset Free Press have an editorial on that? Did it have a view before the vote?
Nope.
Nope.
The editorials lapsed after about the first 30 years. I think the concept at the time, the editorials were started very much to establish the role of the newspaper, which, I mean, I'll just refer to what my great-great-grandfather said in his very first editorial. First of all, to keep pace with the advancing spirit of the age, because the community was opening up, the railways had arrived, big issues were arriving with the connectivity with the rest of the country. But he promised that trust, fairness, and impartiality shall be the characteristics of its pages. Its tone shall be cheerful without levity. In short, to all classes of readers, our design is to make the Free Press a paper for the people.
Right.
So I think that, a wonderfully grand concept. I think we'd all agree with that.
Yeah.
But I think that basic concept stopped it taking any political point of view, because that would not be fairly representative of all those within the community.
And that, in a way, and we're going to get on to the news in a minute, but that in a way is symptomatic of what we have now in the national press, is that if we buy a newspaper, it's got a political axe that it's grinding, doesn't it? And there isn't one that's free. But before we get on to that, I had to ask you about, because I covered this as a young reporter in Fleet Street. Jeremy Thorpe, he was the former leader of the Liberal Party. I don't know if any of our audience remember the Jeremy Thorpe story, but Jeff, tell us about that story.
Okay, well, forgive me for needing a sip of water first of all, because this is the West Somerset Free Press's global scoop. And it just proves to me the value of local journalism, of being able to staff a local newspaper with enough reporting teams to hear what's going on within your community. So very briefly, 1974, Jeremy Thorpe was leader of the Liberal Party. There'd been essentially a hung parliament, and Ted Heath had invited Jeremy Thorpe to join a coalition as Home Secretary. Scroll forward only 18 months into August 1975. A local journalist in Porlock here, actually, in a pub, hears from a local AA man who'd been driving across the moors up above me here, nighttime, comes across this man weeping by the side of the A39 up on the high moor, pitch black, stops to help him. By the side of this man, he's called Norman Scott, might ring a bell, is a dead dog called Rinker. Norman Scott tells the AA man, Ted Letherby, he's called, that another man had driven him there, had brought out a gun, had tried to kill him, Norman Scott. First of all, though, he was the gunman was very worried about the dog, shoots the dog dead, turns the gun on Norman Scott. Apparently the gun then jams, doesn't fire, deserts Norman Scott on this bleak moor at night time. The A-man comes along, he hears the story. Norman Scott alleges that this was an attempt to kill him, Norman Scott, all because of a book he was writing about Jeremy Thorpe. So that story only emerged into the public's gaze because the Free Press happened to employ enough journalists. The journalist Bob Barron got wind of it. I was involved in do we publish or do we not. I won't go through the journalistic criteria I had to kind of tick boxes for, but we contacted the local Liberal Party, we contacted the police. Yes, we did finally publish the story on a Friday morning. That was front page news then. We were front page news then. Dog in a fog case, we called it.
Dog in a fog, that was your headline, was it?
It wasn't my personal one, I have to be honest. I did not sanction it. Anyway, it grew the attention. At that stage, yes, it was known in the circles of Westminster that Jeremy Thorpe was a homosexual. That was not a problem. It wasn't illegal. Nothing was made about it publicly. Why should it be? But the fact that his homosexuality was not the issue. It was the fact that what later emerged, it did take about 3 years until finally police research, I won't delay you or your audience with all the details now, but come, I think it was in October 1978, 3 years later, that Jeremy Thorpe appeared before Minehead Magistrates Court. I actually was there when he appeared, charged with 3 others of conspiring to murder. So here we are, just to recap, the local newspaper, because it was properly staffed, because it had a reporter in the ground, got wind of the story, published it. Published about the man who could have been Home Secretary, who 3 years later was charged with conspiracy to murder.
And just to, what happened to Jeremy Thorpe in the end? Did he ever get? They did a TV drama on it, didn't they?
Obviously it was such a big case. The magistrates here committed. There was a 3-week committal process down here where the full story emerged because one of the defendants surrendered his right to privacy. It was sent to the Old Bailey finally,
yeah.
And oh well, if you saw the programme, it's a 3-part series a couple of years ago on BBC, a very English scandal. The High Court judge allegedly gave not the most balanced of summing up of all the evidence, and all 4 accused were cleared of all charges. Jeremy Thorpe, obviously, even before he appeared in Minehead Magistrates Court, he had resigned as Liberal leader. He lost his seat in 78, 79. He disappeared from public view, and ended up doing good works in the community in one part of London.
Yeah. Sounds like that High Court judge should have taken a leaf out of your great-grandfather's book. And I was saying, sounds like the High Court judge should have taken a leaf out of your great-grandfather's book and had a balanced view on that trial. We've got a couple of comments in from people. Michelle says, let's not forget they're also communities of interest rather than geography. Exactly, we mentioned that at the beginning. Michelle, I meet up with other cyclists at cycle rallies and events, and only annually and biannually, but there have been meetings of the same groups and individuals for 30 years. Yes, there are. Well, there are cycling magazines and newspapers as well, aren't there? And the other one. And Anam says, I come from a very different community. My parents came from the Scottish Highlands crofting communities. Interesting. They were deliberately depopulated in 1886 when an act was passed giving crofters security of tenure, making the crofting community by James Hunter gives useful information. I don't know if this is pertinent. Well, it is pertinent because that was about the time that your newspaper started. So there were changes going on in things. I want to talk to you. We talk about the cycling communities, and you talk about the reporters on the ground there. Jeff, local news now. The newspaper is still going. You don't own it in your family. How is that news compiled? How does the community react to that?
Well, obviously, I mean, everyone understands how the whole financial basis of local journalism has been completely decimated in the last 20 years. We were buoyant, we were making decent money in the 1970s and 80s when the newspaper was the only forum if you wanted to sell a house, buy a house, sell a car. Pages and pages of advertising kept newspapers afloat. Circulation, the cover price helped, mainly advertising. Obviously, since the 2000s, the internet, social media, advertising goes to where the eyeballs are. If the readership is no longer so concerned about the newspaper, the print, holding something in their hand, they go onto their laptops, onto their iPhones, onto their digital devices. So all the advertising revenue is drained away from local newspapers. So you can't employ the staff you would like to employ in terms of the journalistic side, the journalists on the ground. So when I worked on a newspaper down here in the late 1970s, when Jeremy Thorpe was appearing in the magistrate's court, we employed 4 full-time journalists. Yes, I sold the newspaper in 1980 to a passionate man who loved the concept of local papers. At that time, he owned 4 or 5 local papers, a man called Ray Tyndall, later Sir Ray Tyndall. His group now owns something like 280 local titles, which is wonderful, which means they are all still coming out, but obviously they can only survive because of the strength of the overall group. So the West Somerset Free Press is now one of a stable of those newspapers. There are, the group owns 4 or 5 in Somerset. So to how we are now staffed, there's 1 full-time reporter in West Somerset. There's 1 part-time. Because there's only 1 full-time reporter, the idea of being able to attend council meetings, attend magistrates' court, chasing up breaking news stories becomes nigh on impossible. So the reporter's time is mainly not even in an office, working from home, trawling social media, taking the reports of the planning committee, 1 person having to do the entirety of all the local news effectively. Obviously, it's not printed locally anymore. Logistics of that is now printed down in Torbay. The paper is actually put together, and this is not critical at all. It's a reflection of how newspaper businesses have to develop their processes in order to survive. It's actually put together across Bristol Channel in Merthyr Tydfil. So the reporter at home is doing all his work on his laptop. He's submitting his copy. It is a he. And that is all put together, formatted in Merthyr Tydfil, and the printing instructions are sent down to Torbay, and the group buys about 45 minutes for the print run down there to print off the papers. So we are, by comparison, very, very thinly spread on the ground in terms of reporting.
And what is the circulation or readership online and in print?
I must admit, I haven't got those figures for you.
Well, because you were 13,000, weren't you, when you said it was at its peak?
Well, in terms of anecdotally, in the village here, I recall we used to sell something like 250 copies in Porlock.
Mm.
I'm now guessing, haven't got the figures, the circulation manager will wrap I don't imagine they sell more than 50 copies here now.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. And we were talking about the by-election on appeasement, say, and even the suffragette story there. How do you think, with the change of the how the local news is absorbed, gathered, collected, does that impact at all, or would you still have that by-election result, or will you still have the pushing the suffragette into the harbour?
Well, a story of that enormity, of course, that's when the one journalist who had to sort out his priorities covers that story. But it's more a reflection of how the business is changing. There are those who actually say that technology, artificial intelligence, anyone in employment is scared rigid, I think, of what that might do to their own jobs. In journalism, there is a growing thought that AI might actually help local journalism, whereby one newspaper group, the Barrow newspaper group in Worcestershire, is the oldest newspaper in the country. 1690 it was started. Yes, it's now a free sheet. It's owned by a newspaper group. That newspaper group are now using AI to actually write news stories. Very briefly, the planning committee minutes are provided. Those minutes are input into the AI algorithm, which is set to the house style. They say, I want 200 words on this or 450 words on this. The AI will process that. Don't ask me how they do it. It's beyond my experience. Yes, that then is checked by a working journalist. In terms of labour savings, that is dramatic. So a lot of the stories can be formatted into a news story. Yes, they are checked before they go for publication, but that is such a labour-saving device. Yes. It may free up time for journalists to do that one important story.
So just it would take the spin of a press release, say from the local council or a local business, and write it into a news story that would have some degree of skepticism and accountability attached to it?
Well, it would reformulate the facts as provided. Of course, you've got to think, what is the source of those facts? I think you can be assured that the facts as reported in the minutes of a council meeting are accurate. There may be political to and fro, but in terms of the first draft of that story, it will report it. I mean, even more that actually, Humphrey, one newspaper group has started, it actually asked for a freedom of information. So the newspaper group said, write me an application for a freedom of information on, in fact, how much has been spent on tea and biscuits by a council. The AI device sent off the request. It found the right email address to find out who it should ask, got the answer. The answer came back. The AI device formatted into a news story. The journalist did nothing at all apart from AI, apply for freedom of information on this. The following day, the information comes back as a story. The journalist then checks it, publishes it. Yes, of course, there are lots of journalistic criteria you've got always to bear in mind. But there are those who say that in future, it will be like saying to a journalist now, don't touch the internet.
Yeah.
In 5 years' time, it will be just like every journalist will be using this device, still applying their journalistic skepticism, checking the facts before publishing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
And that's fascinating. I think you're one of the few people that that I've spoken to that actually is a an advocate of AI and says it's not going to be a huge threat. Sue Townley says, our local paper went digital, but I no longer read it. Whereas when it came through the letterbox, I always leafed through. Whilst walking the Southwest Coastal Park, we walked through Porlock, and had lunch at the Big Cheese. Is it still there? The Big Cheese.
Yeah, it's still there. There's wonderful food, wonderful coffees, and Stuart still sells a wonderful range of cheeses.
Do you go there, Jeff, a lot?
I bought all my Christmas cheeses from Stuart. There's a very good Stilton, and I'll pass on Sue's recommendation.
That's well. Tell him that Sue Townley likes it as well. From Sue, if my memory serves me, is from up north. Here we have. This is interesting. Lily says, since my 30s, we moved many times as my husband worked in different countries. I have no sense of community except for Goldster. That's the virtual community that we were talking about before. Jean Joyce, my granddaughter is doing a journalism degree and loves it when her stories are published. Iris, our village newsletter is now virtually redundant, even though it is free, because most people are not interested, mostly because the newer residents have no ties with the community before they moved here. Do you have second homers and new residents, Jeff?
We have a lot of second homes, a lot of Airbnbs. It's a major social issue, like many, many parts of the country.
Yeah.
Local families can't afford to buy properties for themselves because of the demand for tourism business. Yeah.
Goodness. So that's a good thing or a bad thing?
It's a terrible thing, absolutely terrible thing for the local population. They can't afford to, even if there was a job available, could they find somewhere to live locally, do that job? It's a devastating development.
Just sit there for a second whilst I tell people what's coming up. Then I want to go back to that point again. January the 18th, that is on Thursday. I am in a community chat with all you guys and Lucinda. So tell us what guests you want, whether we should have the great Jeff Cox from Porlock back onto the show, or Amanda Craig, or Lord Dannatt, or any of those ones we've had lately. January 19th, I'm with the elegantly wonderful Juliet Campbell and her book, Playing Britannia, How She Became Britain's First Female Ambassador and Her Life in the Foreign Office During the Cold War. January 25th, Lucinda is with Jennifer Roberts, The Beauty of Her Age, The Tale of Sex, Scandal and Money in Victorian England. That sounds a bit like your vicar you were telling us about. That was Victorian England, wasn't it, in 1860? 26th, January 26th, Lucinda hosts Book of the Month, which is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And on February the 8th, Lucinda and I are at Riverstone, Fulham for a live in-person Goldster conversation. Email the concierge at goldster.co.uk. I think that's the right address. Come along and throw tomatoes at us, or have a coffee and a cocktail, or whatever you like. Jeff, just you touched on it very briefly. You were talking about the second homes, the sort of desperate people there. Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, I don't want to end on a sad note, but yes, this part of the world is, in terms of social mobility, the assessment of how far can a child go through school and get a proper job in the area. We are 329 out of 329. We are the most disadvantaged community in terms of social mobility, and part of that obviously is, yes, tourism is a big employer, and of course we encourage tourism, and who are coming down, and other people I've noticed on your chat bots have been here. Of course, we love tourists coming down here, but the downside of that is it puts up the property prices, and therefore families can't afford to live here and work here, and they leave the area. It's a double-edged sword, obviously, tourism, and it's a real challenge, particularly at a time now when councils are going bankrupt, and so many of the infrastructure services are being rowed back.
We've got, yes, as you said, Jane says, we stopped from Porlock on our way home and had tea at the Whortlebury Tea Rooms. Do you know them as well, Jeff?
Whortlebury Tea Rooms, I know Helen and Sean very well indeed. Whortlebury, you might not know what they are. Whortlebury are a small bilberry-like fruit that grows up on Exmoor, and is a delightful fruit that makes wonderful jams and sauces. And the
That's
World
brilliant.
Tea Room is still there.
Marguerite says, brilliant interview. Thank you. What a wonderful guest you are. So we will have you back when you go through your next newspaper and trawl there. But your final Goldster thought I want to ask you, Jeff, is, and you mentioned, you know, the poverty there and the social mobility. When you are going through rough times, which we all have had at our age, what thoughts do you give yourself to get through it and get out of bed the next morning?
Big thought, big thought. I suppose it has to be the things that we have some control over. Actually, that's a wrong phrase, because I was then going to say my children. If I have,
You have no control over them.
I suppose, appreciation of family and friends and the community in which you live, and appreciating that, I think, and contributing to it is actually contributing to it rather than just feeding off it. There's so much satisfaction to be gained by contributing at whatever level. You know, it's better to give than to take.
That's appreciative, family, friends, community, and be generous and give. Time's winged chariot is upon us. We have to go. We are being attacked by the clock. Thank you. What a great conversation we've had about the community in West Somerset. A very important part of all our lives, as we've discovered. Until Thursday with myself and Lucinda. Thank you all for joining in. Stay safe, stay active, stay curious, stay community, and of course, stay Goldster. And a very, very big thanks to Jeff Cox for being such an illuminating and compelling Goldster conversation and community guest. I was visaging the suffragette being tipped into the harbour. Thanks, Jeff, for a great show. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you, Humphrey. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.